Just 1 second. There we are, sorted. Okay, sorry about that. Hello everybody, good morning. So before we start, I'm just going to pray really quickly. Thank you very much, God, that we can be here today. Thank you that you've given us such a good book and your great example that we can learn more about your heart from. And I thank you that you've been with me as I prepare this and that you'll be with us as I go through it today. Amen. Okay, so as we begin, I'm just going to quickly tell you a story that some of you may have heard before and will hopefully become clear why I'm telling it. Okay, this story is one of my all-time favourites and is actually one of the inspirations for the RNLI, the Lifeboat Institute. It is the story of Grace Darling. Grace Darling was a lighthouse keeper's daughter in the 1830s on the Farne Islands. So can you picture the scene? Days and days of boredom, interspersed with storms when everyone is on high alert, especially for the daughter of the lighthouse keeper who has no training and none of the skills to be involved in the saving tasks of her brothers and father. Then, one stormy night in 1838, a boat runs aground on the treacherous coastline nearby. Grace sees it from her bedroom window and knows that only a rowboat will get to them. So her and her father get into the rowboat, unsheltered from the elements, and go to save the crew. Grace Darling was 22 years old, and with only the knowledge of what she had seen her father do and no direct training, went out, and because of her bravery, 9 of the crew members were saved, many more than might have been otherwise. I've told you this story because I feel it helps exemplify some of the points I'm trying to make, and I will refer back to it. Now, the verse we're going to delve into today is Luke 19:10. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. So it wasn't all that long ago that I was in an English classroom. And to this day, when I see a sentence like that, my first instinct is to break it down into its key parts. And when I was planning this, I saw it as 2 people and 3 actions. The 2 people are the Son of Man and the lost. And the 3 actions are came, seek, and save. So let's look at the Son of Man first. The Son of Man was just one of the many names Jesus and the Gospel writers used to describe Jesus. One example of this, and there are many, is John 6:62. Then, what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? The writers are very clear when linking the phrase Son of Man to Jesus, and they make it very clear that the Son of Man is in fact the Son of God come down from heaven. In Luke 19:10, it is Jesus making this statement about himself. So, this is a description of one man telling us what he himself had come to do. Then how is this relevant to us today? Why should we do as Jesus did back then? Well, it's relevant because it's a little indicator of what we as Christians have been called to do today. And we know that we should do the same things because of what we know of a process called sanctification. Sanctification is a word we use to describe the process of becoming more like Jesus, or, as Paul puts it in Corinthians, being transformed into his likeness. So how exactly does sanctification work? Well, it works on 2 fronts. Mostly, it is involuntary, but simultaneously it's something we are working towards. And that looks a little bit like when you say or do something, and at that moment you realise you are turning into your parents. I'm sure most of us can relate to that moment. It's happened to me, and it happened to me the other day. My parents and I had gone round to some friends to sit on the patio with some snacks and a fire and a conversation. And the conversation drifted around to seafood sauce, a totally everyday topic that I'm sure most of us engage in regularly. Anyway, one of our friends was telling us his recipe. He was listing the ingredients he used, and he'd say, mayo, and my mum and I would go, yeah. And he'd say ketchup, and me and my mum would go, yeah. And it carried on like that until he said, then I add a splash of whiskey. And both me and my mum very emphatically went, ooh. Our behaviour at that moment was exactly the same. And there's a simple reason for that. My mum raised me. I've probably spent more time with her than I have with anyone else on the planet. Therefore, I have picked up on many of her characteristics. This has been totally unintentional on my part. It's a natural consequence of being raised by someone. But simultaneously, I have deliberately copied certain things she does. I love my mum's cooking, so when I cook, I think about how she would do it. I chop onions in the same way. I copy her recipes. This is because I admire this about her and I want to be the same. In the same way, God is raising us, so to speak. He is our Father, after all. We are constantly with his Spirit, and we will naturally be changed by our continued closeness with him. Ooh. But we also can take an active role in this change to be like him. When we see something about Jesus we admire, which is everything really, he is actually perfect, we are encouraged to copy it. That's why when we see him coming, seeking, and saving, we can identify it as a good thing to do, and do it too. So we've talked about the Son of Man. Let's now look at the lost. So what did he mean when he referred to the lost? Well, there are many ways to be lost. For example, if I walked up a big hill without a phone or a map, I'm pretty sure I would very quickly be lost. But I'm also pretty sure Jesus did not come to earth to join the mountain rescue, however worthwhile that would have been. No, here Jesus is using the Bible definition of lost, and it refers to all those who are still in sin. And because sin is a barrier between mankind and God, it means it's those who do not have relationship with God. They are separated from God by sin. The consequences of that separation from God is eternal separation from God. It's death. Using the story of Grace Darling, it's those in a boat that's breaking apart on stony ground in stormy weather. And if they're to stay there, the outlook definitely doesn't look good. Having identified who the lost are, those still in sin, I now want to talk through the 3 actions, starting with the last action, which is to save. If it was as literal as the lost being on a sinking ship, then we'd know what to do. We'd get in lifeboats, go out and get them off the ship, just like Grace Darling did. She saw people drowning, she got them out the water, an obvious course of action. Do we have an obvious course of action here? What is it the lost are drowning in, and how do we get them out? Well, we have identified that the issue is the lack of relationship with God. So it stands to reason that a relationship with God is the fix. So let's look at how you get into relationship with God. Jesus in John 14:6, tells us that the only way to the Father, that's God, is through him. This might sound like bad news. We can't ultimately reconcile people to God, and we aren't living in the year 30 AD when Jesus was roaming around. But we know that you can have a personal relationship with Jesus in this day and age, and that God acts in our lives. And we know that God has much more power than we do. So what we can do is introduce as many people as we can to Jesus, because he has the saving power we lack. He does the rest. How this introduction happens and how long it takes varies massively, as I'm sure many of you know, even in your own introductions to Jesus. But that's how we get to take part in the saving. Now I'm going to jump back to the first action in the verse, which is come. Come means to move into a location from another. For example, if I invite you to come round to my house, that means leaving where you are to travel to where I live. For Jesus, this took on a whole new level. It would be like if you left Windsor Castle to come and be with me in a shack in a township. This is because, for Jesus, coming meant leaving heaven to come to earth. We learn in John that Jesus has been with God since the beginning. He had been in heaven all that time, which from what we know of it is a perfect place without any sin or corruption or death. A pretty nice place, really. He was living in perfect harmony with God, and he left that to come to earth as a baby, to be born in a stable, to be hated and mocked and eventually killed. Jesus gave up everything, his whole life to save us. So if we're to do as Jesus did, doesn't that suggest that maybe we'll have to give up some stuff too? People who've known me for a while will probably know that about 4 years ago, my family and I attempted to drive to South Africa. This took 5 years of planning and a Land Rover Defender 110. Part of that planning process was deciding what to take. We had a bag that could fit in the seat with us and approximately 1 shoebox each. The rest got packed up in storage for a year. Bearing in mind that I was getting all of my stuff back at the end of the year, it shouldn't have been super hard. However, it was, and I definitely took stuff that was surplus to requirement, such as my teddy. Because do you know what I learned? I like stuff. I find it super hard to give up stuff. Now, Jesus, he didn't just give up stuff, he gave up heaven. No matter how good my books or DVDs or potted plants are, none of them are ever going to be the equivalent of heaven. And sure, in my example, I was giving up stuff for leisure. But could I give it up to save the lost? Could you? That carefully curated bookshelf, that down payment for a house, that Thursday evening you earmarked for me time. Stuff that is worth so much less than heaven. Is that what is stopping us from helping people find God and ultimately find heaven? Finally, after jumping about, the second action that Jesus takes is to seek. This tells us that Jesus went looking for the lost. He didn't just wait for the lost to come to him. He knew that the lost were not in heaven, so he sought them out. Going back to our illustration, Grace knew people weren't drowning in the lighthouse. They were at sea. So she left the safety of the lighthouse and went to them. Just like in our story this morning, the lost lamb wasn't in the flock. It was somewhere else, and so the shepherd went to it. Most people in church buildings are Christians, and most people in your average workplace are not. Church is a very valuable resource, but they aren't, in general, where the lost are. Maybe this is an indicator that we need to talk about Jesus even more outside of church meetings than we do in them. Are we going to where the lost are? Are our declarations of Jesus even reaching the lost? And as always, Jesus isn't asking us to do anything he didn't do first. This verse comes at the end of a story about Jesus having dinner at a tax collector's house. At pretty much no point in history have tax collectors had a good reputation, and this one, Zacchaeus, had a particularly bad one. He had stolen from a lot of people and lived a very comfortable life off his dubious earnings in the same place the people he stole from were. This is the man that Jesus had dinner with. And this isn't the only time he did something like this. He ate with prostitutes, he touched lepers. His closest friends were known as zealots, doubters, and cowards. Jesus went to the people who needed him and needed his message. You have your message. It is what Jesus has done in your life and what he can do in theirs. Who are you seeking out to tell it to? Are you regularly coming into contact with people who need to hear it? And it does look different for everyone. For some, seeking will involve travelling halfway around the world. To someone else, it might be joining a bowling league in town. And to someone else, it might be talking to a parent at the school gates. Wherever it is and whoever it is with, the important part is, are you introducing them to Jesus? Are you telling them about the living God who acts in your life and how he can save theirs? Of course, we can't just ignore the fact that for the last year we have periodically had restrictions on our ability to talk to people we don't live with face to face. That creates a great strain on seeking. How on earth do you seek people out when you cannot see them? But there have been online alphas. Our Sunday mornings have been continuing. And at the very least, we can use this time to plan our next steps, such as the Nativity. We have also been maintaining friendships through creative solutions, such as Zoom quiz nights and the maybe more everyday use of Messenger. But we mustn't undervalue that and what opportunities that friendship affords us. We are currently seeing a relaxation in the rules. Maybe it's time to think about how you can use the opportunity that affords us for God. As I conclude, we know a couple of things. We know Jesus came to save the lost. We know that ultimately, salvation is through Jesus. And we also know that we have been invited to take part in the saving of the lost. In fact, we've been more than invited. In Matthew 28, in a passage we call the Great Commission, we are told to make disciples of all the nations. It may use different words, but this is the saving we've been talking about. And God didn't just give us this message, then leave us to it without any tools or support. We have Jesus' example of coming, seeking, saving. The example of how he talked with people. We have the example of Paul, one of the original church planters. We have a whole Bible and everyone who's come before us to learn from. We have God within us through the Holy Spirit to guide us. This isn't a new idea. We're just the next in a long line of people who get to take part. Listening to this, some of you may be sat there thinking you want to help bring people to Jesus. Maybe you don't know how to help. Maybe you do. But if you want prayer for anything today has brought up for you, or even if you just want to talk through it a little, then I and a couple of others will be in breakout room 1/the prayer room. Feel free to join us at any point until the meeting ends.
Great, thank you very much, Beth. That was absolutely